before we move on to choosing the typeface for the body text of the book, we're just going to take a small diversion and have a look at a little bit of theory. And what we're looking at first is the anatomy of the letters on the line. So the first thing to note is the baseline, and that's the line on which all the letters sit. Now you can see the straight letters sit slightly above the line and the curved base letters sit slightly below the line. Similarly with the X height line, which is the median or mean line, the curved letters rise slightly above it, where the straight letters sit directly on it. We have ascenders, which reach up to the ascender line, and in some older fonts we have a separate, slightly lower cap height line, which also may be where the tip of the letter T reaches to in some cases. And we have the descender line, which is where the descenders on letters like P and F and G reach down to, and again the G may go slightly as it's curved, and the F as it's curved would go slightly below the descender line. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because we're looking at the book design and not actually building fonts, so I'm going to move quickly on to looking at the difference between a serif and a sans-serif font. And if I just zoom in a little bit, here we have a serif font, and here we have a sans-serif font, and as you can see, the bits in red where we have the lines coming away from the letters are the serifs. Now, the reason that we're going to use a serif font as the body font is that when we're talking about print typography, the serifs make the letters much more legible and more easily understood, whereas on a screen you would probably lean towards a sans-serif font because the opposite's true. So serif fonts tend to be categorised in loosely historical terms. We start off with an old style or humanist typeface, and these came along with the early presses from 1465 and the Gutenberg press, and they were an attempt to reproduce calligraphic writing, so they do retain quite a few quirks. The easiest way to recognise an old style font is that if you draw a line between the two thinnest parts of the letter O, it's slightly oblique or slanted, and we call that an oblique stress or oblique vertical stress. There's not much difference between the thinner part of the letter and the thicker part of the letter, and the X height is quite small. Then we move on to traditional and also known as Baroque lettering, and these tended to appear between the mid-18th century and onwards. Now, that's when the first of these types appeared. It doesn't mean that a typeface designed after the mid-18th century must be traditional or Baroque. We do still have old style fonts developed later than that, but that's when the first of them started to appear, and that's how we categorise them. So the transitional fonts, if you again look at the letter O and draw a line between the two narrowest parts, and it has a straight vertical. The difference between the thicker and thinner lines is more pronounced, and also the serifs are much straighter. So if you look at the base of the K and the lines at the top of the P, it's a straight line rather than being slightly curved. They tend to have a larger X height and shorter ascenders and descenders. Now, moving on to the late 18th century, we get what we call the modern or Didone typefaces, and these tend to have a much more regimented feel to them. They're not as organic. The difference between the thick and the thin lines is much more pronounced. They have a smaller X height and longer ascenders and descenders. Although we have very straight, in most cases, serifs, we still have quite rounded finials. And that's one of the main things that distinguishes the modern from the last type of serif font that we're talking about, and that is the slab fonts. Now these did appear from 1800 onwards, and they tend to be the typewriter fonts, if you like. There's very little contrast between thick and thin strokes. There's very little contrast between the stroke of the serif and the stroke of the letter, and they're very straight, very regimented. They may also be fixed width fonts and typefaces, which means that each letter takes up the exact same space. So an I would take up the same amount of space as an M. But that's not in every case. As you can see here, this is a proportional font. So that's just a quick overview of serif fonts.